For 2018's Record Store Day, FSOL put out a surprising release that had been largely unexpected. A new mini-album of tracks, re-recordings and reworkings of the classic 90s single My Kingdom. There was no hint at the time that this was anything other than a one-off release, although given that just about everything else that was coming out at the time was coming along in series, it shouldn't have been too surprising that the following year's Record Store Day release was Yage 2019, and that's what we'll be looking at this week on Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. Future Sound of London, Yage 2019. Release date 13th April 2019, LP, 22nd April 2019, CD and download. Following the success of that re-recording, FSOL cast an eye on another Dead Cities track for the 2019 edition, reworking Yage into an album of new versions. It had already been heard in various forms, from the 1995 version, Hallucination, to the still unreleased Oil remix, Archive 2's Insulin, and various remixes on Electric Brainstorms, plus another unreleased version from the 1996 tour, leading many to believe that it was planned to be the third single from Dead Cities. The reveal that that album's final single was actually intended to be Glass was somewhat surprising. Still, one way or another, Yage got its own long-form release in the end anyway. The track had always been a particular favourite of Brian and Gaz's, so in that context it's unsurprising that, despite not being a single originally, it got given this particular focus. Unlike My Kingdom Reimagined, Yage 2019 is much closer to actual album territory, with the LP edition running to 11 tracks and 43 minutes, and the CD and download editions 13 tracks and 52 minutes, which brings it to longer than some of the From the Archives releases. The CD, featuring 2 bonus tracks and released a couple of weeks after Record Store Day, was pretty much a given by this point. The vinyl was reissued in a standard unnumbered edition later in the year. It's an interesting set of tracks that is, at times, more consistent than My Kingdom Reimagined, and at times less. For the most part, the new material is on the more breakbeaty end of things, very often including samples from the Hallucination version of Yage, an alternate take of which appears here as Ayahuasca. Mostly background sounds and percussive hits, with Simon Wells' guitar slashes also appearing on a few pieces. These really give a feeling of one of the band's 90s singles, with largely new tracks held together as a suite by a handful of recurring sounds. In between these, however, are a small number of late 2010s style synth pieces which feel somewhat out of place amidst all the rugged drum loops and chugging guitars. None of them are bad, but I've never been completely convinced at their relevance to the overall feel of the album. Although technically not closing with silence, floating into focus and then moving away has such a long fade out at the end that, despite cross-fading, it sounds like silence unless you turn your speakers right up to maximum. What's most interesting is that the mood is actually pretty different to what one might expect from a Dead Cities adjacent record, much like with My Kingdom Reimagined in that sense. The atmosphere stems from the slightly more tribal sounding end of the band, with a rawer texture for the most part, and additions of vocal chants, flutes and more guitars to many tracks. Given that Yage is an alternate name of ayahuasca, a hallucinogenic drug taken by indigenous people of the South Americas, this does make sense. The theme is matched by Lisa Butler's artwork with what looks like a primitive sculpture overlaid with hands and paint. It's a bizarre and somewhat unsettling image, and variations of it appear throughout the CD booklet as well as on the back cover. I've also seen a few people online in various places suggest that Peter Gabriel's 2023 album I.O. had a cover inspired by this, or indeed ripped it off. I've no idea if Gabriel is even aware of FSOL's more recent releases. It could very well just be a coincidence. Bizarrely, Alan Dougans is credited for the pyramid image only on the LP edition, while the image itself only appears in the CD booklet. Who knows? The album's text is for once not in Eurostyle Extended, conventional Eurostyle, or any of the other similar fonts occasionally used, making it stand out amongst the band's FSOL digital releases. Furthermore, the album cover features a different font of the tracklist and spine. This does break up a run of CD spines that all match, which I will never ever forgive the band for. Eurostyle Extended does appear in the booklet, first alongside some technical looking numbers including the phrase Yage 2019 build and the now familiar run of 5 logos. This image also appears on the LP's inner sleeve, and the existence of that itself is a bit of a rarity. And later on page 6 as part of a miniature block of credits featuring the phrases Another Ever So Well digital release and Earthbeat Visions. It's only the second UK Future Sound of London physical release not to feature any buggy artwork at all after Expander. The familiar 5 logos appear throughout the art, including on the front cover. Yage 2019 has gone down pretty well with fans, although the more heavily rhythmic approach, especially on longer tracks, seems to have alienated a few, as I have come across a handful of people describing it as one of the group's most boring releases. A few more people were disappointed that it's not a follow-up to The Woodlands of Old by Yage, managing to conflate Yage the title with Yage the alias somehow. My initial impression of the album was overwhelmingly positive. The Environment series, following the initial volume, seems to have followed the band into more emotive, down-to-earth music, and this album felt to me very much like a return to the weirder, more overtly psychedelic sounds of their 90s material. With a few years hindsight, I still largely agree with that assessment, although it might have become my least played of the re-recordings at this point. Nevertheless, it's a pretty good record that feels like a modern update of the 90s FSOL sound and anything released since the launch of FSOL Digital. Yage 2019. By far the most faithful recreation of all the re-recordings, this new version of Yage is virtually indistinguishable from the original until compared side by side. The mix is somewhat different with more emphasis on treble, there's a touch more compression used. Otherwise, the only significant difference is the opening environment, beginning with a bell being struck, followed by some synth drones and flute notes. These immediately set up the slightly tribal feel of the album from the get-go. However, upload this re-recording to YouTube and you'll get hit with a copyright notice for the 1996 version. They are that similar. Floating into focus and then moving away. One of the few synth-forward tracks on Yage 2019. This is built around layers of fast-moving arpeggios, all major key and pleasantly airy in tone. It's a pretty dreamy track, but I still find it very difficult to work out how it's connected to the Yage theme in any real sense. It closes on a very long fade out to what is effectively silence, wrong-footing the album at a very early note. Despite this, it is a lovely track in its own right, and it includes its own closing environment, which is uncommon at this point, of synth swells and drones. Purged. As with many tracks on Yage 2019, Purged takes hallucination as a starting point rather than the final version of Yage. Using the buzzing samples, a couple of percussive sounds, and Simon Wells' chugging guitars as the basis, the piece then builds up with new breakbeats, very much in the strangely cold, rigidly cut-up approach found on numerous tracks from this era, with the new synth chords and some creepy plucked notes. There's also a brief inclusion of a voice saying what sounds like Yage, which I think might even be from one of the Yage and Cyberface conversations from 1992. I might be wrong though. Hallucination's closing guitar riff also appears pitched up an octave. This is an excellent, energetic track. We Flew Together. Continuing the theme of alternating between chuggy Yage-themed tracks and bright, breezy synth pieces, We Flew Together features lo-fi, bleepy arpeggios and tinny drums. It's playful, almost childlike and very pleasant, although once again I'm not 100% convinced by its connection with the rest of the album. Yage Rhodesia / Insulin. This piece was first heard on Electric Brainstorm 1 under the title Yage Beijing. Rhodesia and Beijing aren't exactly geographically linked, but there is some political history between Zimbabwe and China, so the renaming is intriguing. It's effectively a reworking of Hallucination once again, with the same chugging guitars and deep bass, as well as the iconic Yage flutes, but presented in a much more sparse arrangement, with a slow, roomy drum beat and fewer layers of samples. The final 2 minutes seek straight into Insulin, as first heard on From the Archives Volume 2. A very enjoyable alternate take on the theme. Voodoo Doll. The closest Yage 2019 gets to an amorphous track, and undoubtedly Gaz's biggest contribution to the record, Voodoo Doll is a funk-tinged piece. The drums are played very straight, but layers of acoustic bass, wah-wah guitar, Hammond organ, proggy flute, fuzzy synths and occasional saxophone notes lend the track a sleazy feel. The only link to Yage comes in the form of the chirping background samples as heard in Hallucination, but the raw sound of the piece fits in well with the bulk of the album regardless. There's more than a touch of the 1997 sessions to the track. Earth Spirit. A breezy ambient piece that could easily just be a closing environment to Voodoo Doll, Earth Spirit features background drones, minor keys, string melodies and layers of dense textures with tribal flutes making an occasional appearance and closing on vocal chants. An enjoyable atmospheric interlude and the ambient piece that fits the album the best. Ayahuasca. Ayahuasca was the title given to Hallucination for its appearance on Electric Brainstorm's 0.5, so it was little surprise that this would be roughly the same track. The inclusion of chanted vocals at various occasions throughout, plus a few additional samples and drum glitches, mixes things up a little and makes it a more interesting piece. I've never been overly fond of the original, with both its appearances starting ISDN show and following the gentle lizard crawl on From the Archives Volume 1, making it seem like a long, intimidating block of sound. In this context, however, it makes total sense, and the sprinkling of additional new sounds really livens the piece up further. It plays at a very slightly slower speed to Hallucination and emits that version's extended guitar outro. Slowly Stumbled. The third of the three synth pieces from Yage 2019, Slowly Stumbled's deeper, lower sound and emphasis on sweeping textures in the background makes it feel much more at home than the earlier two, a much needed interlude between two especially intense tracks. The People of Yage, Humanoid Rebuild. A real oddity on Yage 2019, this looks like it might be a remix of a track called The People of Yage. Does that exist? Or maybe just a remixed version of Yage, although it contains no audible samples from the track. It's even unusual for 21st century Humanoid being a low, rumbling piece with clicking microbeats and deep sub-bass, with slowed down, mangled speech appearing over the top. The track first appeared on Touched Music FSOL Night 3, unbeknownst to listeners at the time. Yage, Sunset Strip. The only track known to bridge both the Hallucination and Yage versions of the piece, featuring the former's Simon Wells guitar line and the latter's weird Greek instrument, and first heard on Electric Brainstorms 2 in 2008. The breathy synth pads and emphasis on flutes make this the closest there is to an ambient version of Yage, and a wonderfully atmospheric mix it is too. Some very grim sounding reverse sounds, as well as warmer synth pads and EMS gurgles act as a closing environment. And then it ends on the opening horn note from Dead Skin Cells. As someone who's a bit precious about the band's music and doesn't really like cross-pollination of eras, this brief lifeform sound on a Dead Cities adjacent release bothers me probably a lot more than it should. A sensation of vagueness. It's somewhat unfair on vinyl purchasing fans that what is quite probably the best track on Yage 2019 is restricted to CD and download versions of the album, and it's why CD is always my go-to for this particular record. Sensation of Vagueness is a remarkable track, a beast of a piece with relentless tribal drums, flutes, brooding synth pads and a gradually growing vocal chant. If one ever wanted to hear FSOL soundtrack a particularly paranoid trip taking place in the middle of a rainforest, this would be the place to go. It also ties in the record with the previous Record Store Day release, sharing sounds with Culture of Individuality from 2017's archived environmental views. An unexpected career highlight for me, this one. The images were simple and few, quite a fitting name for this minimal piece that closes Yage 2019. Odd, almost atonal synth pads and an awkward, staggering drum machine beat play for the most part, with occasional synth squelches on top. It's slightly quieter than the rest of the album, and its stripped-back nature in comparison with the rest of the album's more intense feeling makes it seem like a bit of an anticlimax. I'm not especially fond of the piece, but its stark mood is a much-needed breather at the end of an otherwise very heavy-going record. "2019 remixes, compilation tracks and FSOL digital releases. Another year, another handful of one-offs. EMS Piano gets its remixing hat on, FSOL and Humanoid reunite with the detuned label once more, Plaid come on board to remix Humanoid, and FSOL Digital puts out a release by a non-FSOL artist for the first time in many years. Middlemarch, The Dead Complain of Their Burial, EMS Piano remix. Released on The Mirror and the Light. Middlemarch is a project by myself and fellow FSOL board member Dimitris Avramidis. In 2014 we began asking friends if they'd like to remix tracks from our debut album, Wolf Hall, and eventually, 5 years later, said remix album came out. I have a lot of reservations about this final record, but this is neither the time nor place to talk about those. Among the artists providing remixes are FSOL board owner Pete Godfrey as Cubus, longtime FSOL board and FSOL list member Tim Dwyer as Offland, regular FSOL contributor Riz Maslin as Neotropic, and of course a certain project called EMS Piano. I was expecting a Yage or Humanoid remix when I submitted the track, so was surprised to get this, although given the piano and synth nature of the original track it does make sense. Demetrius's bleak piano melodies are ground up, reversed and filtered, creating a backdrop of dark ambience, although its synthy flutters and other synth sounds take the piece further into melancholia than the already pretty grim original. Several of my field recordings and other effects are also utilised to create further texture. As the first track on this series that I'm directly involved in, I'm unable to give a proper judgment other than to say it's my favourite remix on the album, and both Demetrius and myself are incredibly proud to have the piece on there, remixed by EMS Piano. There was a miscommunication with the label at the art end. For the CD edition, the proper credit wasn't included at all, simply saying it's remixed by Brian, as opposed to the remix by EMS Piano engineered by Yage at 9LW credit as seen on the Bandcamp. The future sound of London, Skinny Zam, released on DE 10.06. Having contributed a couple of tracks to the Detuned label in 2016 and 17, Everswell returned in 2019 with a piece for the series of DE 10 split 12-inch EPs. Skinny Zam is a simple, mellow track, very much in line with the now very familiar late 2010s IDM sound. Fast, skittering hi-hats, punchy kicks, synth harps and various stabbing sounds. Fairly chilled piece with a darker undercurrent. It appears on the A side of the 12-inch, alongside a piece by Monolake. On the B side can be found David Morley. Humanoid Uling, released on Secret Rave 05. A Humanoid exclusive for the 5th Secret Rave release. In keeping with the compilation's title, Uling features some ravey stabs, a particularly growly 303 line, and some deep synth melodies. An enjoyably breezy, energetic slice of ravey acid. Humanoid. I've been dreading this. 8818 Stacker 88 to 80, I don't know, the title is a reference to 30 years of Stacker Humanoid. Released on DE 10.08. Continuing in D-Tune's 10th anniversary celebrations, Humanoid contributed to the 8th EP with a new take on Stacker Humanoid, the title suggesting it was one piece considered for the 30th anniversary release in 2018. Utilising the Berserk samples from the original, as well as rave whistles and tambourine lines, the rest of the track is entirely original, with a brand new 303 line, some intense beats, layers of effects. It's a much darker piece than the original, replacing the original's heavy intensity with a more insidious, brooding repetition. As with all the material from this period, both Brian and Gaz are credited with writing the piece, despite Humanoid still being a Brian solo project. It's joined on the EP by such eminent names as the Cosmic Commando, Luke Vibert and Air Liquide. Humanoid 8818 I can't believe in a few videos time I'm going to have to say that about 20 times. Plaid remix, released on DE 10.10. Rounding out the label's 10th anniversary with their final split EP, D-Tune brought together Humanoid with Warp Records legends Plaid for this remix of the track. While containing much of the imposingly dark vibe of the original, Plaid's remix largely rewrites the piece, adding their own bass line and replacing the slightly more staggered drums of the original with a chunkier groove, while retaining the acidic elements. An excellent remix. Apertures, Missing Skies, released on Touched by Silence. In 2014, I asked Brian if he'd like to contribute some of his EMS Synthy AKS sounds to a track of mine. At the time I was working largely in collaborative pieces. He said send it over. It ended up turning into a whole new piece and we decided it could be the start of a new project. The project was called Apertures and our first track was on the Touched by Silence box set, but was also home to the Controlled Vista CD, but more on that in a few weeks and that will become logical why when I get to it. So a largely ambient piece with my own piano playing centre stage, with growing textures and synth drones before a subtle beat comes in towards the end. I'm not remotely qualified to be judging a track I made, to be honest, but I'm happy with it. I think Brian did a great job with some bare bones piano that I sent. Seafar, Totem, release date 14th of November 2019. the first non-Dougans Cobain artist to get a digital release on FSOL Digital in 5.5 years. Melbourne-based electronic artist Seafar delivers his new album Totem. 16 tracks of dope-grade electronic weirdness, classic Seafar. Fun fact, Seafar takes its name from a youth hostel in Glasgow Brian, FSOL, lived in while training as an electrician pre-FSOL years. Fun fact 2, the youth hostel also features in Gregory's Girl, a film from 1981. And on that note, we come to the end of today's video. Do leave me a comment down below. Did you enjoy the video? Do you like the music mentioned? Give me some comments and thoughts. I love reading them, love replying to them. I love it when you press like or share, subscribe. So go ahead, do that, make me happy. And I'll be back very, very soon with a video, finally, about Built by Humanoid. That'll be here, hopefully next week. So I hope you'll join me for that.